project in Rojava is so beautiful in so many ways. Like I saw people trying to build community solar microgrids, all these things that we think of as these niche progressive interests. That is how they are trying to construct their society, setting up cooperative agriculture projects, all these things that I think people wouldn't think of in a place which has been so scarred by war. But they're very much committed to, as they rebuilding in a way which is more sustainable, which is more equitable, and which includes women at every stage and in every step. And it's really sad to me to see so much violence being directed against that, to see that project in danger. It's deeply, deeply upsetting, right? Like it offered an alternative in an area, in a part of the world which has been so scarred by centralism and strongman states, right? Like the idea of the strong male leader. We can stand in Kamishlo, the capital of the AANES. And from there in a day, we could drive to the site of the Armenian genocide. Then we could drive to the site of the Yazidi genocide. And then we could drive all the way to the site of the Anfal, right? The genocide of the Kurdish people by Saddam Hussein's regime. Mm-hmm. Those are three different groups genocided by three different states. And we could touch them all in a day, right? The history of the state in this part of the world is drenched in blood. And the idea that we are seeing an ethno-state, right? Another Syrian Arab republic, which excludes Yazidis, which excludes Kurds, which excludes Armenians, which excludes Assyrians. It's petrifying, right? For those people who fought for so long and sacrificed so many of their children for something better, right? For equality, for brotherhood, for living alongside one another. It's hard to see the world seemingly indifferent. And I know there's a lot happening in America and it dominates the news, but the United States has done very little, if anything at all. I can't really think of anything it's done to defend the people who fought alongside American troops against the Islamic State.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada and sometimes elsewhere by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Conor Curtis, Director of Communications at Sierra Club Canada, and this is part 2 of our podcast on Rojava. In part 1, we talked with Arthur of the Emergency Committee for Rojava, or I.C.E, which aims to raise awareness of the autonomous region of Northeast Syria known as Rojava, which they point to as an experiment in feminism, pluralism, democracy, and environmentalism from its beginnings that includes a sweeping vision of social ecology. Since recording that podcast on January 7th, 2026, the Syrian Transitional Government based in Damascus has conducted a series of attacks against Rojava in what is an attempt by the Syrian government to ethnically cleanse the area of Kurds and other cultural minorities and to destroy the autonomous region. For context, the new Syrian government has ties to Al-Qaeda and is friends with the US administration. One can only surmise that a common disdain for women's rights and for minorities is enough to bring the US government and the Syrian Transitional Government together. In this Part 2 episode on Rojava, recorded on January 27th, 2026, we talk with James Stout. James is a journalist, author, and podcaster from the podcast It Could Happen Here, and in this episode we delve further into the social ecological aspects of Rojava's revolution. We also discuss recent developments in Northeast Syria, the history of Rojava, and James's recent trip to cover the local resistance to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, in Minnesota. I want to warn you ahead of time, this is a very disturbing podcast episode, and we talk a lot about the history of conflict in the region of Northeast Syria, as well as reports of recent violence. We also discuss ways you can help call for a peaceful resolution to the situation in Northeast Syria, and I will put links as they become available to ways you can help with humanitarian efforts in the region in the description of this podcast. We will forgo the normal introduction to simply say that you can find the Environment in Canada podcast on Hobja Media Network or wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on CKUT Radio in Montreal 90.3 FM. And you can find out more about Sierra Club Canada at sierraclub.ca. So, James, for those tuning in, first question always is, who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, glad to be here. I'm a journalist. What I mostly do, I have a PhD in history, which I don't use very much. What I mostly cover is conflict and borders. And then I like to say I cover the people that those two things impact as much as I cover the things themselves. So the last few years, I've been working on this book. It's called Against the State. And I was interested in how anarchists organized in moments of war. That's something that I became interested in during my PhD studies into Spain, and then that interest broadened out when I have been covering other movements around the world. In addition to that, I do spend a lot of time involved in mutual aid at the southern border of the United States.
And I know I was thinking about your recent book when I was researching questions for this episode, and you're looking at different non-hierarchical forms of organization based on mutual aid. There's been a lot of talk in Canada around mutual aid recently for a number of reasons. And one of the places you examine is Rojava in Northeast Syria. And I guess very quickly for people tuning in, quick notes version of what is Rojava and like how would people situate that?
Yeah. I will inevitably miss something here that somebody will think is pivotal. So I just want to apologize in advance, I guess. I think the way that they would describe what happened in Rojava is to use an analogy that might be like your listeners might be amenable to. They talk about mycelium, and they talk about the way all these spores spread all the way through the soil for a long time. And then when the ground is moist and the temperature is right and the conditions are right, then little mushrooms pop up, right? Mm. That would be how they would describe their movement. So if we start in 2011, right, with the Arab Spring, understand that those spores had been spreading and percolating for a very long time. We can look back, to the early 1980s and the political thought of a guy called Abdullah Öcalan, which inspired a number of different groups in a number of different countries. The specific revolution in Rojava begins with the withdrawal of the Assad administration, right? So Assad was a dictator in a line of dictators in Syria until December of 2024, when he became a resident of Russia instead. But Assad's regime had oppressed Kurdish people for a very long time, right? They'd oppressed their language, they denied them passports and citizenship. They had moved Arab families into what they called the Arab Belt in an attempt to, I guess, like dilute the Kurdish population centers. It's an ethnic cleansing, is what it is, right? Like, or a population transfer is a more kind of sanitized word that people use. It had also tried to turn that part of Syria into like the breadbasket of Syria. And you will see this with a very intense agricultural system. And anybody who's been to Rojava will tell you this, right? You have these beautiful green mountains, and then you see these plains in northeastern Syria, which have been stripped of their natural foliage, right? Stripped of trees, and they appear very barren. It looks, people in Canada will be familiar with the plains prairie farming, right? It looks like that. And so in 2011, the Assad state withdraws from some parts of Kurdistan, and various Kurdish groups rise up to fill that gap. And in between then and the mid-20 teens, these groups organize in a certain way, and then the group that becomes the most ascendant is the PYD, right, which is one of these Kurdish parties. And the groups that I wrote about in my book, they are the military that defends the autonomous area that came from that withdrawal of the Assadist state, and which then grew because, as I'm sure your listeners will remember, the Islamic State took up residence in much of Syria during the civil war, right? It came to control much of that area using weapons that it looted from the Iraqi state and it looted from the Syrian state, using volunteers from around the world who fought in the Islamic State, right? Islamic State, or ISIS or ISIL, like we can use these different acronyms. But the Islamic State grew extremely rapidly in the 20 teens. And it was, I guess if we go to 2014 now, we can see like the Islamic State is sweeping across Iraq, right? And it's sweeping into this area called Shengal. Shengal is where Yazidi people have historically lived. Yazidi people are, most of them would probably say they're not Kurdish, but they are, some people would say they were Kurdish. I've heard people say they're Yazidi Kurds. They're certainly sort of, if not Kurdish, then like closely related to Kurdish people, I guess. And the Yazidi people, crucially, are not Muslim for the most part, right? They have a different belief system, closer to Zoroastrianism, and they have a peacock. Like, I think it's an angel more than a god. But the Islamic State therefore saw them as heretics and had begun perpetrating a genocide against Yazidi people. And the Yazidi people had retreated to Shengal, their sacred mountain. And as they retreat into this mountain, the most horrible crimes you can imagine are being committed against the people who remain behind. And it's in that moment, I think, there and in Kobane, which we can talk about, where the military forces of they refer to Rojava themselves as the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria. People from that region who are already fighting the Islamic State at home, right, and who are losing their own villages to the Islamic State, make the decision that they are going to go to Shengal and they are going to open a humanitarian corridor for the Yazidi people.
Okay.
And I spoke to one of the people who did that, and this operation that they successfully conduct is really one of the first times when the Islamic State has been pushed back, right, has been forced to retreat, someone had successfully stopped it from carrying out its genocidal goals. And I think in that moment, the world came to sort of see that at the time, the Kurdish freedom movement, I think it was often understood as an ethno-nationalist movement. And I think we can see in this moment that it genuinely believed in what it talks about, which is this idea of brotherhood of nations, right? That it wasn't a movement by Kurds for Kurds. It was a movement that began with Kurdish people, but believed in a brotherhood of nations in the area they would call Mesopotamia. So this area in between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the land between the rivers. Then we also see in Kobane, where the Islamic State, again, is sweeping through massive swathes of territory. The YPG, which is the YPG and the YPJ, if people are not familiar, are the men's and women's branches of the military that defends this area. And we can talk about how that is organized separately. In Kobane, they are able to resist the Islamic State, and they're eventually able to push them back through this ferocious battle. I've spoken to people who fought there who told me that they stopped carrying as many magazines for their Kalashnikovs because they just wanted to have more grenades, because they were fighting at such short distances and so close that they just wanted to be able to continue lobbing grenades into rooms as they moved through. And at this time, we see a tremendous solidarity with the people fighting in Kobane, right? Kurdish people from Turkey are flooding across the border to fight in this horrific battle. Kurdish people from Iraq travel through Turkey to enter. Kobane backs up against the Turkish-Syrian border, right? So the battle is sort of backstopped by the border. People are constantly flowing through the border to reinforce the defenders of Kobane to fight against the Islamic State. And it's this very heroic resistance that eventually succeeds, that eventually pushes IS back with the help, for the first time, of United States fighter, and I should say the coalition to defeat ISIS planes, but they're largely American, right? Not to denigrate the involvement of other nations, but the bulk of the people there are American. I know there were French jets over Kobane as well. But in these two moments, the sort of mythos of the YPG and the YPJ is born. Now, later, they become the Syrian Democratic Forces, and the YPG and the YPJ are elements of the SDF. That is because the SDF itself is a majority Arab organization, or was a majority or Arab organization until a few weeks ago, and they become the partner force for the coalition, which again is largely backed by US air power, and these are the people who fight ISIS on the ground. To a massive extent, they suffer heavy casualties. 12,000 people died in that fight against ISIS. And in the meantime, while they're doing this, right, they're liberating territory from the Islamic State. They're liberating women from one of the most misogynist movements in recent history. They are trying to build democracy without the state. They are trying to work out a way to construct a society according to the principles of what their thought leader, Abdullah Öcalan, called democratic confederalism. Öcalan himself was incarcerated this entire time. He's been in prison in Turkey for this entire century. But his political thought changed as he incarcerated, and the political thought of the movement has moved away from a sort of state socialism, right, like a Kurdish socialist state, to the idea of building democracy without the state, to the idea of communities governing themselves, to councils, neighborhoods, even streets getting together and organizing themselves and devolving power down to the lowest level it possibly can be. At the same time, this revolution is being built by women. It is not a revolution that uses women or includes women. It is a women's revolution, right? There are women at every stage and in every part of the revolution. This is a very important tenet of the movement. They would tell you, like, an ecological perspective and a gender perspective are integral pillars to their revolution. And so, for instance, when people are chairing a committee, there is a co-chair system such that a man and a woman must always chair the committee together, so that men can't be in positions of authority over women.
So the way, like, when I talk to people here in Canada and they will ask, like, what is this? I kind of have to go to, well, remember when you saw on TV the women fighting ISIS? That's who we're, because it's sometimes hard for people who have not been following the situation in Syria as closely.
Yeah, definitely. I think, the images that people will be familiar with will be of the YPG fighting ISIS, right? Like, they famously wear bright, colorful headscarves, images of them dancing in their combat equipment, or listening to Taylor Swift, or some of these sort of tropes that have become, that broke containment from people who are interested in environmentalism and interested in building a more just and equal society. That is the image that people will be familiar with, but we have to understand that those women fighting were only able to fight because of a revolution that liberated women across that area and across different ethnic groups, right? Like, this wasn't just a Kurdish revolution. At the time, I think it really believed in a brotherhood of people. And we saw Arab women fighting alongside Kurdish women. We saw Syrian and Yazidi and Armenian women all joining up with the SDF to push back the Islamic State.
You mentioned this aspect of ecology or a different, and it's interesting that you opened this by talking about how much the land and the agricultural system that had been forced on this area was very, shall I say, monoculture, right? Very much. The idea was to increase productivity for really the rest of Syria. There's a sort of a radical vision of social ecology, as I understand it, too, that they've been trying to implement at a local level.
Yeah, so I think Öcalan's thought was very much influenced by Bookchin's thought, Murray Bookchin. I think that happened I know that happened while he was in prison, right? Because he was reading these texts. And that influenced the direction of the movement. And so, ecology is a pillar of the movement. It's foundational to the movement. Just to give a small example, on Öcalan's birthday, they like to plant trees. That is, like, if you want to, I guess, show their understanding of the ideology, the way they do that is by planting trees. And there's a big campaign to bring trees back to Rojava. And you see this in, like, as part of these community-led projects, right? Part of their project is to return nature, to return green spaces to this place, which has been bombed since 2011. It has been the site of killing and dying for 15 years now. And so, having been to a few of these places, they are brown and beige, right? Because the soil has been literally poisoned by bombs, by bullets, right? We have been engaging in destruction. So to see people in that environment rebuilding and doing so in a way that centers an understanding of humans living in companionship and solidarity with nature rather than in opposition to it, or just using it as something from which they can extract the most possible profit with no concern for what that does in the long term, is genuinely remarkable. If you travel to Rojava, you can't not go around and see co-ops where they're growing things. One of the things that I know people have found very hard about, so Turkey has sponsored a number of jihadist groups. They operate under the Syrian National Army, or they did until they became part of the military of the new Syrian Arab Republic. They're also sometimes referred to as a Turkish Free Syrian Army, which I think does a disservice to the original Free Syrian Army, which also very much believed in, like, a secular state and the brotherhood of peoples. One of the things that people find hardest about these areas that Turkey has taken is the destruction of olive groves and the confiscation of olive groves, because these are a source of, I guess, ancestral wealth, right? There's so much love and resources put into growing these olive groves, into developing them as a place that can sustainably feed people, provide things that they need. So losing those is a massive loss to the people who are also removed from their land and their homes.
It feels like we see that over and over again in conflicts, especially when there's an attempt to remove or get rid of a group of people whom a state sees as in the way, right? That's the
Yeah.
destruction of local environments. It's the destruction of the things on which they and the turning of those environments into purely resource economies. On that note, and you've touched on this, there were attempts to find a peace between the Syrian government in Damascus, the new Syrian government, and
Yeah.
for lack of, the Democratic Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria.
Yeah.
The new leader of the Syrian government has past ties to Al-Qaeda, but seems to be perfectly welcome in the Trump administration at the moment. What has been happening more recently? And I guess, do you have any messages for people maybe listening here in Canada?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very difficult time for Rojava right now. It's a difficult time for the revolution. They have lost huge amounts of territory in the last 3 or 4 weeks, really, right? So this government that came to power in Syria in 2024, the one that deposed Assad, was largely led by HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which, as you say, it is a group that had previously been sanctioned by the United States. The United States used to have a reward out for the now president of Syria, who goes by al-Shara. He used to go by Julani, right? But he changed his name and then he put on a suit, and now he's no longer a terrorist in the eyes of the United States, right? He's been removed, or HTS has been removed from the sanctions list. And for about a year, there was an extremely uneasy tension between the AANES and what is referred to as the Syrian Transitional Government. This exploded in fighting in Aleppo. I can't remember, it was late 2025 or early 2026 when this began, because things have been wild. But this fighting focused on two neighborhoods, which sometimes they're referred to as Kurdish neighborhoods. And it's important to point out that there are like Syriac and Assyrian and Armenian and Yazidi people in these neighborhoods too. There are probably Druze and Alawite people. Previously in 2025, Druze and Alawite people were both subject to pogroms, essentially by the STG and associated forces.
That's the Syrian Transitional Government.
The Syrian Transitional Government, yeah, al-Shara's government. Sorry, it is an alphabet soup out there. And so,
no, I know from following the issue a bit myself, and just it's as you say, the last few weeks in watching it, it does seem like there's kind of a humanitarian crisis developing as a result.
Yeah,
well, yeah,
because these people are displaced from Aleppo, right? And then, as they are fleeing, they are displaced again. Because what the Syrian Transitional Government has done is successfully turned many of the Arab tribal groups who fought alongside the SDF against ISIS against them. And so this leads to people who fled from Aleppo. They fled to another place, and then that place becomes unsafe for them. So they have to flee again. Now, many of these tribal groups are seemingly very happy to no longer be in the AANES. And you will see pictures of crowds celebrating that they have left the AANES. If you are looking at those pictures, I would ask you to investigate the gender of all the people who are celebrating, because it's all men in everything I've seen. For instance, and I would just say, like, there's also been a lot of disinformation put out about this. For instance, I think it was in Tabqa, a statue of a fighter was pulled down. This was presented as like Arabs liberating themselves from Kurdish authority. It was a statue of an Arab woman, Arab woman who liberated her own home from the Islamic State, who fought with the YPG, but as part of a sisterhood of peoples. And unfortunately, the areas controlled by the SDF, look at Raqqa, right? Raqqa is a majority Arab city. The SDF had controlled Raqqa since they took Raqqa and collapsed within days, right? Now, the other things that have been lost are the massive prison camps which exist in that part of Syria, which mostly hold either foreign fighters from ISIS or mostly women who were, in the Islamic State case, were always women who were married to ISIS fighters or who themselves were part of the Islamic State, and their children. This has been a problem for the AANES for a long time, and they have pushed very hard for the international community to take those people back, and the international community has failed in many cases to do that. And that has meant that they are left kind of holding this ticking time bomb, right? These prisons have become radicalization factories, right? Children grow up in a place where they're only surrounded by people who were themselves members of the Islamic State and who are now extremely resentful against the Western world, specifically against the AANES for incarcerating them for so long, right? And so this has been a big problem for a long time. In the fighting, people have escaped from these prisons and the SDF has lost these prisons. So the STG is now administering those prisons. Now, HTS and ISIS are not the same. HTS fought against ISIS, but nonetheless, this remains a massive issue, I guess. Like I'm not a big fan of prisons. I don't think they're how we solve our problems. I also understand that this situation was extremely difficult because these people have been part of a repugnant political project, and their states have, like if you look at the case of Shamima Begum and other people, right, like they have been rendered stateless. Britain has removed, in Begum's case, her citizenship, right? So she's a stateless person.
Which I remember that I don't know happened at the time, and I think appealed to people because, we're rejecting, but really it was also a rejection of dealing with the consequences of something one of your own citizens has done, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And taking responsibility for looking after them, for lack of a better word, right? And reforming them theoretically, right? Yeah,
exactly. Like she's still British. She grew up in the United Kingdom. She went to school in Britain. Like we can say that her ideology, the thing that she was part of, is repugnant. But the UK can't just wash its hands because it doesn't like that and say, okay, someone else deal with it, right? It's at best extreme cowardice. And it's just leaving the problem for someone else to deal with. And that problem is now becoming, there was an attempted Islamic State suicide bombing today in Iraq. I saw that has not happened for a long time. But a bunch of people just escaped from these prisons. So maybe it's related to that. But yeah, what has happened now is that Kobani is once again under siege. We are seeing the people who first pushed back the Islamic State, the people who made these huge sacrifices in Kobani, right? This city that was turned into a pile of rubble. It's once again a battleground. Once again, I heard today that people are struggling to eat. Babies are struggling to get formula. In theory, there is a ceasefire. In theory, there was a 15-day extension. There was a 4-day ceasefire signed, I think, on the 20th. That was then extended for 15 days, but fighting in practice is continuing and not as widely as it was, but fighting is continuing. We have heard of Kurdish people being pulled out of cars and the men executed. The SDF, just to be I guess as balanced as they can be here, the SDF did issue a statement that one of their fighters had taken pictures with dead bodies. And it looks like these people it looks like they had their hands tied in many cases, right? That person's been expelled from the SDF. There have also been many videos of captured YPG women being murdered and then their remains being desecrated in horrific manner. And I'm not aware of those people being expelled from the Syrian Arab Army or the STG's military forces. Regardless, right, this is a part of the world where people have suffered one of the worst wars of the 21st century, and they are continuing to suffer. The project in Rojava was one of the, if not the only, genuine attempt at a multi-ethnic democracy in the Middle East, right? It genuinely offered liberation. Like I've been to Rojava, I've seen this with my eyes. It offered liberation for women in a place where women have been oppressed, where women were oppressed by the Islamic State. And it really did believe in a brotherhood of peoples. I have seen in recent days some people repudiating that thought, but I don't think that's a majority position. I still think that there is belief in this idea that the people can and communities should live alongside one another as brothers, right? As siblings, I guess would be a better word. That there are still Armenians fighting on behalf of the AANES. There are still Assyrians. A number of Yazidis actually came from Shingal to fight for Rojava, which I thought was quite touching, 12 years after people went from Rojava to fight for the Yazidis. And so this idea of brotherhood of nations, I think, still exists, although there are people who, I guess, are renouncing that. Regardless, right, if we look at the alternative, the Syrian Transitional Government, they haven't changed the name from the Syrian Arab Republic as it was under Assad. Kurdish people, if people are not familiar, are not Arabs, right? So it's inherently exclusionary. The military is still the Syrian Arab Army, right? That again is inherently exclusionary. There is al-Shara decreed that there would be some Kurdish rights in the constitution, rather not in the constitution, but passed by decree. So evidently something that can be decreed can be removed by decree, right? Like it's not an inherent right.
It's not. Yeah.
Yeah. I was looking at the Kurdish language education. It's 2 hours a week opt-in, which is essentially what Assad offered them. Right, like this is not the same. And just to like explain the language issue a little bit more, I guess the older people in Rojava will have grown up being forced to speak in Arabic. Maybe they spoke in Kurdish at home, but their language, as part of the Assad regime's efforts to destroy their communities, it attempted to destroy their language, right? And so you have this funny situation where the younger children who went to school in Kurdish, whose first language at home and outside the home is Kurdish, sort of have better Kurdish than the folks who began reading and writing in Arabic. You also have this very amusing situation where vowels will just be swapped around in place names pretty often because Comanche is written with the English language alphabet, right? Well, it's not quite the same, actually. You have some extra letters.
Like kind of special syllables with it.
Like a S cedilla and to make the sh sound, C cedilla. But previously things are written with the Arabic script. So you'll get vowels swapped around in place names, which makes it absolutely impossible to use like Google Maps because you'll get 3 different versions of the same name from different people. But I think that's quite charming in its own way. You just have to ask people for directions and they always know what you're saying and you always get to the right place eventually. But yeah, this project in Rojava is, right? I shouldn't say was. The project in Rojava is so beautiful in so many ways. Like I saw people trying to build community solar microgrids. All these things that we think of as these niche progressive interests, that is how they're trying to construct their society. Setting up cooperative agriculture projects. All these things that I think people wouldn't think of in a place which has been so scarred by war. But they're very much committed to, as they rebuilding in a way which is more sustainable, which is more equitable, and which includes women at every stage and in every step. And it's really sad to me to see so much violence being directed against that, to see that project in danger. It's deeply, deeply upsetting, right? Like it offered an alternative in an area, in a part of the world which has been so scarred by centralism and strongman states, right? Like the idea of the strong male leader has perpetrated. I saw, like, I guess, give an analogy, Tom Barak, the US envoy to Syria, said that federalism doesn't work in the Middle East, right? And I just want to give this is a bizarre statement considering that if we look at the history of the centralized state, we can stand in Kamishlo, the capital of the AANES, and from there in a day, we could drive to the site of the Armenian genocide. Then we could drive to the site of the Yazidi genocide. And then we could drive all the way to the site of the Anfal, right? The genocide of the Kurdish people by Saddam Hussein's regime. Mm-hmm. Those are 3 different groups genocided by 3 different states. And we could touch them all in a day, right? The history of the state in this part of the world is drenched in blood. And the idea that we are seeing an ethno-state, right, another Syrian Arab republic, which excludes Yazidis, which excludes Kurds, which excludes Armenians, which excludes Assyrians. It's petrifying, right, for those people who fought for so long and sacrificed so many of their children for something better, right, for equality, for brotherhood, for living alongside one another. It's hard to see the world seemingly indifferent. And I know there's a lot happening in America and it dominates the news, but the United States has done very little, if anything at all. I can't really think of anything it's done to defend the people who fought alongside American troops against the Islamic State. And I know that there are people within the American military who are upset about that and the American state who are upset about that. I know a lot of the folks who went over there with the US military were deeply impacted by their time in Kurdistan and fighting alongside the SDF and seeing firsthand what that project looked like. But that doesn't mean that America will be a good friend to the people of Rojava, right? It seems like that is very much not going to be the case. Of course, many individuals from the US and from all around the world traveled to fight alongside the Kurdish people, right, as part of the YPG within the international tabur. Hundreds of volunteers from around the world fought with them against the Islamic State. However, that doesn't mean that the states and governments of the world or the states and governments of those people came from are going to be in solidarity, right? They're not. We have seen very little support from anywhere outside of the other Kurdish areas in Iraq, chiefly Kurdish areas and Kurdish people in Turkey, right? Kurdish people in Turkey, once again, as they did in Kobani, flooded across the border. In this case, they broke down the border fence in Kamishlo to fight. And like to fight what again will be a horrific battle, right? This is seeing scenes of desecration of corpses, scenes of horrific violence, and that they've chosen to enter that, right, when they didn't have to.
And ultimately, from the sounds of it, an ethnic cleansing, if that the Syrian government at this point seems to be intent upon committing against.
They talk about an equal participation of Kurdish people, and they talk about a Syria for everyone. But when we look at what happens, we see them calling Kurdish people pigs, stamping on their corpses. We see these horrific actions. Yeah, understandably, people are extremely scared about an ethnic cleansing, another ethnic cleansing, like I say, in this area, which is already so drenched in blood.
And those are the precursor signs historically of that coming to be. And
they did it to the Druze earlier this year, right? They did it to the Alawites, right? They were another group of people who are Arab, but they have a different faith. Assad was an Alawite, for example, so there's a lot of resentment against that community, even though not all of that community was Assadist. But yeah, we have seen these pogroms in Syria in the last year under the STG. There is any reasonable person would expect that.
Yeah. I'm always shocked and a bit surprised because I, obviously work on the climate and environment file in Canada, and the amount of excuses that, quite frankly, all of our governments at all different levels make for not doing anything about any of it. I mean, when you're talking about solar microgrids in Rojava, when you're talking about these attempts at cooperative agriculture, when you're talking about these attempts to do environmental initiatives, I do think, are there things maybe we should be taking away? And I know I've listened recently to a podcast you did. You just got back from Minnesota from reporting on what's happening there.
Yeah.
I noticed you mentioned in the podcast that sense of solidarity was something that reminded you in a way of Rojava that you were witnessing. Are there things perhaps that we should be taking away from that as people now, and maybe things that should be inspiring us to go a bit further in what we think is possible?
Yeah, look, I don't think anybody, if you had said at the start of the Arab Spring, there will be an area here where democracy exists without the state, where women will be in the driving seat in every position, where people will live as equals, right? Different communities will live as equals. No one would have believed you, I think, right? Like it is incredible what the revolution in Rojava has achieved. And I think there's a lot that we can take from it. Obviously, like many of us will not find ourselves in a situation where we are fighting against the Islamic State. And I hope very few of us do. But the way that they organize, I think, has been something that I've taken a lot from. And one of the things that I think has meant a lot to me, and that I think I would implement in my own organizing going forward, is the concept of tekmil. Tekmil means report. And it would be easy to see it in the lens of like self-criticism, right? Like in the kind of Maoist tradition. But I want to kind of repudiate that, at least for me. My understanding of tekmil and the way I'd like to implement it draws heavily on something so people in Rojava will call each other friends as opposed to comrade or any particular rank. You won't call someone captain so-and-so, you call them haval. Haval is the Kurdish word for friend. So haval so-and-so. Something some friends said to me was that they had lost a very dear friend in the end of the battle against the Islamic State. And the way they remembered that friend was through the kind, gentle, and loving way he gave them criticism when they did tekmil. So in tekmil, there's a criticism and a self-criticism element. And the way that they phrased it to me was that he expressed his love for them by helping them become the people they had told him they wanted to be. And that now that he was gone, by being the people he had helped them become, they could continue to carry him with them. And I thought that was really touching, especially as someone who, unfortunately, like I work in a career path where people I care about deeply die because I'm covering the practice of killing and dying. And so that really made me think about tekmil differently, right? Like, how can we express our love for each other and for the things that we struggle for by making each other the people that we wish to become? And I think if we can enter into tekmil with a genuine right? We have to do away with this idea of like criticism and then like a Maoist sense, right? Like in like a struggle session sense. We're not trying to beat each other down or prove one of us to be better than the other, but we all have a shared goal and we all want to get there. So we're trying to hold ourselves accountable to the things that we said we do to become the people that we wanted to become. And I thought that was really touching. It's something I've thought about a lot. And the other thing is that together we can do amazing things, even in the darkest times. Like I was in, as you said, I was in Minneapolis last week, and I was absolutely I was so impressed and so proud and so taken aback, and which I'm sort of ashamed of myself for, because I want to say I believe in people, and I do. But the extent to which every single person in Minneapolis is pushing in the same direction, right, which is to protect their neighbors and keep ICE away from them. It reminded me a lot of what I saw in Rojava. Rojava kind of feels like you're in, if a whole area was a punk house, like, you know, when
I live in
you're
Montreal, I'm very familiar with what you're describing, but
yeah, not a punk house, you know, like, you know, it smells kind of weird and there's some tofu in the fridge. It's a science experiment, but like a punk house in the sense of there's something beautiful about those places where we all share everything and we all help each other, right? And
I love punks, to be clear. That wasn't a derogatory thing.
Yeah.
I'm quite a fan. So
yeah, punk music is it's the reason I am the way that I am. Like experiences with punks and anarchists have made me so much more hopeful that we can do it ourselves. I met an older lady in Minneapolis, very nice lady. It was cold. I guess you'll be Celsius people, so that's nice. Like, okay, yeah, so it's like -10, something like that, -15. And we're out, and this lady's not wearing a hat. And she's standing on a street corner, so we go and talk to her. She's standing outside a daycare actually run by Somali people. And we're talking to her. She said her father fought in World War II, and she thought he'd be proud of her, which is very touching. And she said, we wish our politicians would do more, but they're not going to. So that's okay. We'll do it ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish people would just take that. If they take nothing else from my book, if they take nothing else from what's happening in Minneapolis, it would be that. You don't have to wait. You can do it yourself. And maybe you can do it better, because inherently it won't be one person driving the ship, it'll be everyone driving the ship. And so if we hear from everyone and we hear their concerns and we listen to them, then we can do things better. And I think that's something that I took from Rojava. Like I took a sense of hopefulness. Even the time I was in Rojava, we were being heavily bombed by the Turkish state drone strikes, mostly also some F-16s. And it was very sad. I met a mother who'd lost a 13-year-old son, and I could see how there was this gaping hole in that family's life. And that was very hard for me to... it's one thing to be in all the excitement, but then to just sit with a family and drink tea while they sobbed about their kid was rough. But I saw people taking care of them. And I saw... It doesn't give their kid back, right? Nothing does. It's horrible. But at least, like, their kid got a chance to... This was a young boy, but I know that there are also many young girls who have died, right? They've had a chance to live in a place where they are valued as people in a way that women aren't in all parts of that country. They're building something which really offers a different vision of how people can coexist, especially in a place which has been so fraught with ethnic tension for so long. And like, we would be foolish to let that go, without a struggle. And I think that this time when that project is under threat, it's most important for people in these countries, especially, right? Like, we don't have to be people who believe in their revolution. We don't have to be people who believe in the ecological revolution. We can just be people who think we should be decent. These people gave 12,000 of their children. You can stand in a graveyard in Kamishla and look at lines and lines and lines of graves, right? And you can go through by date. You can say that was the Battle of Kobane. This was Afrin in 2018, Manbij. We can look at every campaign, every town that was liberated from the Islamic State, and we could see the people who died doing it. They died to liberate those communities, but also like their death was part of what meant that there will not be another attack like there was in Paris, right? These horrific Islamic State atrocities. And For the most part, the US, Canada, European nations didn't have large numbers of troops on the ground. Large numbers of their children didn't die. Those people who did the killing and the dying for the most part were the SDF. And it is shameful that these states would now abandon them to die alone when they made a sacrifice for all of humanity, right? Like the Islamic State was horrific and inhuman barbarism. And so it's shameful that our states would abandon them at a time when they need our help.
Well, I was just going to say, I think there is a good case to be made for calling your MP in Canada, your member of parliament, and telling them to put pressure on the Syrian government to stop this attack upon people and to pull back from the brink and to come back to the peace table around this. I don't know how you feel about that, but
yeah. Do whatever you can. Like, I'm not going to shame you for doing anything. Like, do what you can. If you have an MP and you can call them and they will listen, then yeah, you should do that, right? It's going to be better than tweeting about it. You could skeeting or whatever you do, Facebooking. If you want to donate to some humanitarian organizations, there are many of them. If you just want to send a message of solidarity, I'm sure the friends would appreciate it, like whatever it is. But we should all try and do something, because this project is in grave danger. And it's very inspiring to see people willing to risk their lives again. But like, you don't have to do that. It's not a binary all or nothing. Whatever you can do, whatever it is in you're able to help people. I think we have to show that same solidarity, right? Like the same solidarity that Kurdish people showed with the Yazidi people when they were willing to risk their lives. Like, if we can try and reflect a fraction of that, then hopefully this project will remain. It's certainly a lot smaller than it was, but Kamishlo, Hesaka, Kobani, all these places are still they're still thriving communities, and it would be a real tragedy for humanity if we lost this.
I do hope that people listening as well take back something about, as you say, not waiting around for leaders to do things to make the world a better place. I mean, we had a really interesting podcast a while back that was a report actually called "Don't Wait for the State." It was on renewable energy in Canada specifically, and it was just about how communities ultimately often fill all these gaps that the state doesn't fill, and sometimes drive the state to actually do something better, because they look at it and they go, "Oh, that's successful. We should try to take credit for it," and then they fund it, right?
I mean, I think, especially in the context of the Canadian state, I guess, like so many of our Indigenous communities for so long have shown us that we can organize without the state, that we can take care of one another, right? We don't need the permission or the authority of the state to do so. And I know that people in Rojava would see their struggle as one of Indigenous solidarity. So like, I want to make that really clear. I'd love for people to know more about Myanmar as well. My book compares Spain, Myanmar, and Rojava. So the revolution in Myanmar, also very inspiring to me, also very beautiful. Also an example, I guess, of what I want people to take away is that even in the darkest times, we can build beautiful things. And it's a pretty dark time. You guys north of the border have things a little different politically, but it's a dark time for all of humanity right now. Like, not only are we staring down the barrel of an authoritarian regime, we have an authoritarian regime in the US, but we are destroying this planet and we don't have another one. But none of that means we should stop being hopeful, right? And stop believing that we can do beautiful things. We can, as my Kurdish friends would say, live a beautiful life.
I really like that. I think, I'm going to have to get you back on to do a second episode on Myanmar as well, and the other part of what you've been researching.
Yeah, I'd love to. We can talk about elephants, forestry, and all the things that are happening there. But I would love for people who are interested to get the book. Like, you don't have to buy it if it's beyond your financial means. Just go to your library. I'd be very happy if it was in the library so people could access it.
That's the other thing. Sorry, before I go, how do people find out more about you?
Oh, yeah. You can find me on Blue Sky and Twitter. Fortunately, most of this social media for people in Myanmar and Rojava is going to be on Facebook or Twitter. Don't have a Facebook, but I do have a Twitter. It's James Stout. Same is true on Blue Sky. James like Bond, Stout like the beer. And then they can find my book, which is called Against the State, Anarchists and Comrades at War in Spain, Myanmar and Rojava, just about anywhere the good books are sold, or they can go to akpress.org and you can buy it there. There's also an ebook. People would prefer it that way. And I make a podcast called It Could Happen Here. It's part of the Cool Zone Media slate at iHeartMedia. People could probably join the dots between US politics and the name of the podcast. But
yeah.
We try not to just talk about the bad things, but also the beautiful things that are happening. And if you want to know more about migration to the US, I went into the Darien Gap to report on that in 2024. So if you're looking for an episode, maybe start there. It's a bit of a heavy one. I'm proud of the work we did.
I'm going to have to check out that It Could Happen Here podcast. I definitely haven't listened to it before or cited it several times.
Yeah.
Thanks again, James. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to talk about this stuff.
Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Hobson Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us.